All right, welcome to another Ideas That Matter conversation. I have here somebody I've been very much looking forward to chatting with, in part because of the sort of work that she does and some of the interesting positions that she's developing in those works. So this is Krista Thomason, who is an associate professor of philosophy at Swarthmore. She has two books, and we're going to talk a lot about the book that isn't yet in anybody's hands, but hopefully will be soon. And that is Dancing with the Devil: Why Bad Feelings Make Life Good. So that already in the title, quite an ambitious and controversial claim that we'll get into. But she's also published in 2018, Naked: The Dark Side of Shame and Moral Life. She's also published a lot of articles and encyclopedia entries, book reviews, book chapters. And so we're going to be talking a lot about emotion, but I think we'll probably spill over into other areas. And I should mention that you have in your bio three things that I found particularly intriguing, in part because I share in them. So you list yourself as being a metalhead, a sports nut, and a home chef.
All true.
And I mean, so I'll ask then, this is sort of trivia, but like, were you a metalhead since childhood? Did you get into it
Ah,
because somebody introduced you to it? I
Good
mean, it
question.
ties in with
Yeah,
the emotions, I think.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. No, so I started listening to heavy metal when I was in college, actually. And occasionally your rotten ex-boyfriends do you a favor. And so it was a rotten ex-boyfriend who introduced me to metal. The first one that I bought, the first CD that I bought that was sort of mine was Judas Priest Screaming for Vengeance. And
Oh,
it was like a revelation. It was amazing. And I
yeah,
bought it
yeah.
completely on a whim, totally on a whim. I was like, I don't know what this is. I've never heard of this before. Let me see what's going on with this. And I listened to it, and that it was kind of it. It was it. It was they were my intro, and then they became my favorite, my very favorite of all time.
You know, you picked something like right in the heart of what we call classic, or now they call it traditional heavy metal,
Absolutely.
which I suppose makes sense because, you know, its origins is decades and decades back. But that's a great album
Love it.
and great band. There was actually a big Twitter controversy in one of those post sites recently about that very album. You know, is it number one? Some people are like, oh no,
Uh
it sucks compared to this one.
Oh yeah, yeah. There's some controversies in sort of priest fandom about, which were the ones that like everybody should like. And oh yeah, I
You
know
know,
those.
uh, this friend of mine who's a guitar professor at Berkeley School of Music, we had a classic metal class for a
Nice.
while before we got too busy. And we did one session on the best albums by classic bands. So we picked Iron Maiden,
Nice.
Dio, Motorhead, Judas Priest, and then I think Accept. We probably should have picked the Scorpions instead, but because they have a wider catalog. But
Yeah.
it's interesting. Painkiller dominated in the polls because we ran a bunch of polls.
Ah, okay.
And I think the reason was, I mean, I considered it a good album, but I don't think it's as good as Screaming for Vengeance or Defenders of the Faith or my
Sure.
favorite, Sin After Sin.
Uh,
But it's
I
got,
pegged you as a sin after sin
oh,
guy.
did you?
I did.
Well, that would be very interesting. So let me just tell you this, and then you can tell me how you came to that conclusion. So I think that there's just so many fans. It's sort of like that you know voting, not the kind that we have, but like sort of it's a little bit like ranked choice voting. You know, there's just too many people who really, really like Painkiller for the other albums to get much traction. Even if they get a lot of votes, they're
Mhm.
splitting it among
Yeah.
themselves as opposed to like the Painkiller
Right.
people. So how
Right.
would
Right.
you
Right.
peg
Right.
me as a Sin After Sin guy?
So this is pretty surface level judgment, but the folks who tend to be like really hardcore and really really into the genre and really knowledgeable about the genre tend to be sin after sin people.
Oh, interesting.
That's just been my experience. Has been like
Well,
the more knowledgeable you are about the genre as a whole, the more likely I think
yeah.
sin after sin tends to be your album.
So this will be a good segue into raising a question. So you're doing a lot of work in philosophy of emotion, but in a whole bunch of allied areas as well. And very often, and you tell me whether this is the case for you. We'll get people who will say, well, what you're doing really isn't scientific. You need to be like looking at psychology, and psychology is a hot mess by itself. We could talk about that in a bit. But, what you're talking about is going by a sort of hunch, but it's not just like I've got this, loosey-goosey intuition. It's not based on anything whatsoever. And I think that when we're talking about the emotions in particular, so part of that is affective, right? But it's also cognitive. It's not just a gut feeling or something like that. But when we're thinking about our emotions and other people's emotions, we often do have to rely on these sorts of hunches or inference to the best explanation or abductive leaps or stuff like that. I mean, do you see that as something important?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something I actually get criticized for quite a bit in my work, particularly by, I think, other philosophers who are a little bit more, I'm gonna say empirically, but I mean that in kind of a narrow sense, like
Okay.
who think that it's really important that if you're going to talk about emotions, you really need to be up on sort of the latest psychology research, neuroscience research, etc. Um, so what's funny about this is I feel like people don't remember this conversation that Aristotle has in De Anima, where he talks
Okay.
specifically about this. And he says there are really two different ways that you could study emotions. There's a way that you could study them that he refers to as the approach of the student of dialectic. And then there's the approach of what he calls the student of nature. And he describes both of those positions, and he says, look, the student of dialectic is going to be the person who thinks about anger and talks about the reasons that you feel it and what you tend to do with it and that sort of stuff. And then the student of nature is going to talk about anger in a natural way. They're going to describe it as the boiling of the blood around the heart, right? Which is
Yeah.
like, that's very metal all by itself. Um, so, and then he just sort of says, these are two different ways of understanding something. I'm going to go with the student of nature because that's what I'm interested in. But that's it. He doesn't argue that the student of nature is the only way to understand it or even the best way to understand it. He just says that's a way of understanding it. So in the book, I sort of set this up and say that's a way to understand emotions, but here's another way to understand emotions. We're
Yeah.
talking about our experiences of them and our relationships to them. And those kinds of questions are not easily addressed by getting up to speed on the latest psychological or neurobiological research on emotions. They're better understood from a kind of traditional humanist perspective, right? Again, what Aristotle calls the collecting of indoxa, reading people who have thought really hard about this kind of stuff in the past and kind of getting a sense of what the various landscape is of the positions that are out there. And then, testing them using your own methods and thinking to yourself, like, is this the best way to describe this? Are there counterexamples that I can come up with? And I think what's funny about that is I think those of us who are more kind of humanistically inclined or historically inclined philosophers, we don't tend to sort of highlight that as a methodology, as though that's
Right.
that is kind of what we do, right? And that's and if it was good enough for Aristotle, like, why isn't it good enough for us?
You know what I found much earlier in my career when I was in places where it was mostly analytics is I could get away with describing what I was doing, and it very similar to what you're talking about, just by calling it by the term hermeneutic, because they had heard it, they knew it was something. They
Totally.
didn't. It wasn't the weird, wacky, continental stuff. And I was doing history,
Mhm.
philosophy, essentially, and they would leave me alone. They'd be like,
Right.
I guess that's a valid way of going about this.
Exactly. It's incredible if you just sort of like give it a name, suddenly people are happy.
Yeah, I mean, there could be a whole discussion about that. But I do want to go back to something that I was going to ask you
Mm.
about. So, we've got this vast field of psychology, and then it bleeds over into other things as well. You mentioned neuroscience. And, one of the things that I discovered when I was doing a lot of work on anger was that when it comes to the emotions, there's no consensus in psychology as a field about like how many emotions there are, how they work, which ones are primary. And it sort of mirrors or models what went on in the history of philosophy. I mean, we've got, so if we take Aristotle and, we get beyond just the rhetoric classification, because there's other emotions like grief, Pothos, that discussed in the Nicomachean Ethics, and we just put it side by side with, say, the Stoics, right? We've already got two very different theories of emotions and two different valuations, and then we can add others in. And it seems to me like people will appeal to like capital S science or capital P psychology. And I do see this a lot in educational literature that deals with the emotions. Um, and it doesn't seem like they get that there isn't any single agreed upon approach to rely upon. So, I mean, you could say, well, that's a bad thing. We're not making progress like we ought to be, but we've got a lot of experience with that philosophy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, could we also take that as a good thing and say, well, we can be pluralistic, we can draw on what we want to, we don't have to be wedded to one single model or theory that's out there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I find myself actually quite confused about why it is that people sort of appeal to this, like you say,
Mm,
capital S science or capital P psychology, especially when you actually start looking at the literature. I
yeah.
feel like so much of that attitude comes from people who may not have sat down and really started to read it. And I tell you, to give a plug to Lisa Feldman Barrett's book on, I forget the name of it. God, I can't believe it blanked on it. But it's about, she sort of calls into question this whole idea about there being basic emotions, right? Which is
Oh,
supposed to be a
yeah.
staple of
Yeah.
psychological literature on emotions. And I remember reading her book and thinking, well, man, if one of the like pillars of emotional research in psychology is actually kind of up for debate, and she does all these really complicated studies to sort of show that, the research that was done to support the thesis, if you tweak those studies, the research just falls apart. And I thought, well, gosh, they're having the same scholarly debates that philosophers are having, right? So
Yeah.
I think that's fine. Let them do their thing with their methodology and run the tests and run the experiments. That's great. It's a living, breathing discipline in the same way that philosophy is a living, breathing discipline. What I really kind of want to resist is this idea that sort of they've got the right way of studying it, and
Yeah.
that what we do is somehow always beholden to what they're doing,
Yeah.
and that it's not just sort of two different ways of understanding the same thing, or that we might be interested in very different kinds of questions, and that's fine. Like, so I want a kind of pluralism where I feel like there's a lot of people who want, no, psychology's got to be on top and philosophy has just got to be, waiting for the answers from the lab coats, and that's the attitude that I want to resist.
Yeah. I mean, philosophy of emotion, first off, philosophers were around doing it before the psychologists came out as a separate discipline, just a few centuries ago. But it seems like why should they get to claim that space over everybody else? I mean,
Yeah.
sometimes it's just sort of assertion. Well, we're the
Yes,
ones. I mean,
absolutely.
an analogy to this would be Sartre sort of ruining existentialism for everybody else by defining what it is,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and then other people being like, well, if that's what you say it is, then I guess I'm not an existentialist anymore, Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's come back to the new book.
Mhm.
One of the things we were going to talk about was the writing process,
Yeah.
and maybe before we get into like bad feelings, let's talk about that. I mean, I'm sure some will come up along the way because
Mhm.
writing is, I mean, I don't know, I won't speak for you on this, but as somebody who's done some writing myself, it can be a very frustrating, anxiety provoking process, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it's when I came up with the idea of sort of talking a bit more about the writing process, I sort of thought, we don't do that enough, even in
Yeah.
our kind
Yeah.
of regular professional lives. We're not very upfront and honest about how we go about doing this. And I think and that I think feeds into a certain kind of mystery that people have about, I can't tell you the number of people who have asked me, well, like, what's it like to do philosophy research? what does that even mean to do philosophy research, right? And
Yeah.
so I thought, the writing, pulling back the curtain a little bit on the writing process would in some sense help answer that question too. But yeah, so in some sense I was like super lucky because I did most of the book while I was on sabbatical. I had a
Mm.
wonderful fellowship at the National Humanities Center, so I was researching full time, and that was great. This is the first time I've written a trade book. So this book is for the public. It is not for philosophers. I hope philosophers read it and like it. I have my doubts that you know how we are.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
preparing myself for lots of criticism here. But my real goal in the book was to give anybody who wants to think about their negative emotions maybe a little bit differently a way to do that. So learning how to write a trade book, that was really tough,
Mm.
really tough. And
Mm.
I
So
needed
how did
lots of
you
help.
learn how to do that?
Help, help from people. So
Okay.
I had readers who were just my friends, people who, somebody who is who may have gone to college but didn't study philosophy. People who are just the kind of folks who want to read a book, who might be
Mm.
curious and interested, but who have no expertise whatsoever. And my beloved husband, who is a fiction writer, who is very good at wordcraft, read every draft I think that I gave him because he was looking at it from like that perspective, so the
Yeah.
actual
Yeah.
wordcraft perspective. And it would not be, and my fellows at the National Humanities Center who read drafts for me, who were not necessarily philosophers or who talked with me about my ideas, they all that helped me be able to present it to someone who's not an expert. But that I would never have been successful at that if I didn't have that help.
So that's sort of on the like half to finish end of it. And so I'm gonna, facetiously bring up one of those questions that anybody who's a creative gets. Where do you get your ideas from? You know, so there
Totally.
has to be an initial
Yeah,
motivation for doing
absolutely.
the research. Well, what
Absolutely.
was that for this book?
Yeah, so it really sprang out of my first book. So my first book was on shame, and the motivation behind the first book was, I started reading a lot of philosophical literature on shame, and this is the reason that the book has that title. I started reading in all of these different examples of the kinds of cases that people come up with shame, and it's things like in expressions of ingratitude
Mm.
and minor transgressions of various kinds. And I remember reading all that literature and saying to myself, yeah, but where are all the naked people?
Okay.
Meaning there's a section of cases of shame that don't really fit with this certain kind of conception that you find in the philosophical literature, where shame is kind of already moralized and it's about moral failings.
Right.
And I'm thinking, but there's lots of cases of shame that are not about moral failings. And so what happens if we stop centering the moral cases and we start centering these other cases? What would we discover about shame? Would we come up with a different conception of shame? And that doing that work made me start thinking about the relationship we have to our negative emotions in general. And
Mm.
I think that our relationship with our negative emotions inside philosophy and outside philosophy is fraught. And so once I started thinking about that, I started thinking there's work to do on negative emotions in general. So I started doing more philosophical work, anger, contempt, spite, that sort of stuff. And then I got to the point where I thought, when you just listen to people talk about their negative emotions, they're so scared of them for the most part
Right. Yeah.
and so resistant to them. And even if something terrible happens to you and you are really mourning or you're really angry, people are so quick to try to correct your feelings. And it was that impulse that got me going on a more popular version of the work that I had been doing in philosophy, because I thought, I think other people out there
Yeah.
who just want to think about this, I think they need something, they need some other voice in the mix that's saying, maybe these bad feelings aren't so bad after all.
It's interesting because in the sort of like philosophy is a way of life, broad popular philosophy where people are taking, Aristotelianism or Stoicism or stuff like that. Um, that dynamic that you're talking about happens all the time where people are, in some respects, I mean, the Stoic would say, well, you're not made to feel it because you decide whether you take that on or not. But the overall tenor is, okay, we've got these negative emotions. You do better not to feel them. Let's try to get through this as quickly as possible so you can just feel the good emotions. And with Aristotle, we've got something a bit different. It's less about, well, off or on, and more like, well, how are you feeling this anger, or how are you feeling this? Well, I mean, it's interesting because with Aristotle, right? No good amount of shame, right?
Exactly,
But
exactly.
um yeah, so we get that, and I think that's a very important thing to say. And I'm constantly in like groups having to say, okay, we're not going to repress our emotions. We're not going to like put them aside. We actually need to look at why you feel anxious and what that's coming from. And then once you understand it, you can work through it.
Hmm.
And you see similar things in like positive psychology. You want to have a
Absolutely.
preponderance of positive over negative emotions, and we'll do a lot of like journaling and
Hmm.
trying to give affirmations to ourselves to change our mindset on stuff.
Yep.
And I don't want to endorse like negative emotions totally, like some wild romantic saying, they're all great, they reveal being to me or something, because some of them are, we could say
Hmm.
really damaging or pathological, but there has to be a lot more scope for that. And grief is a great example. I'm not a stoic, I'm an eclectic, but I do a lot of things in stoic circles. And my close companion cat Sassy died a year and a half
Oh.
ago, and it's the animal I've been closest to in my life. And I wrote some things about grief, and I got some flack from people who are like, you're not supposed to be writing about that, you're supposed to be processing it and getting over it right away.
Hmm.
And I was like, first of all, it's not stoic to actually tell other people what it is to be a stoic, especially if you don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
But what makes you think you should jump in here and
Yeah.
that somehow grief by itself, and they'll be like, well, it's one of those four basic bad emotions. It's under lupe, pain, and I was like, well, so much the worse for stoicism then,
Right.
on that issue. But I wanted to go back to so you've got this piece, alienated emotions
Mhm.
and self-knowledge. And this
Yeah.
seems core to what you're talking about as your motivation.
Yeah.
And I'll mention to anybody who's watching or listening, you can actually access this on Krista Thomason's website.
Hmm.
So you can read it for yourself and see what she's saying here. But it seems to me, so first of all, what is an alienated emotion? That's a technical
Yeah.
term that you've got. And then how does it figure into this broader, like, let's reclaim some of the
Hmm.
space of negative emotions that you were talking about?
Yeah, yeah. So I got really interested in alienated emotions because of an emotional, what I call an emotional incident in my own life.
Okay.
So I start, this is in the piece. So I start off with this story about so I had a pet mouse when I was a kid. Never in a million years thought of myself as somebody who was afraid of mice, had no, like, other people would sort of freak out about them, and I was like, I would hold my pet mouse. I loved her dearly, and we had a whole relationship and everything. When I'm an adult and I live in my first house, I hear noises in the kitchen at night, and so I walk into the kitchen. I'm awake, and because I'm in graduate school and I'm always awake at night. So I walk into the kitchen at night. I flip on the light, trying to see what's going on, and a mouse runs across my foot in
Hmm.
my kitchen, and I absolutely lose my mind with fear. I mean, not just like it's screaming uncontrollably. I dash in this like mad dash over to the mat that's in front of the sink in my kitchen, and I stand there screaming absolutely uncontrollably. Wake my husband up. He has to come down the hallway, and I actually am paralyzed with fear. It's the only time in my life I have ever literally been paralyzed with fear,
Oh,
and
interesting.
he has to like walk me physically out of the kitchen, and I just completely lose my mind. So I am baffled by this reaction. Absolutely, truly baffled by this reaction. Nothing in my past has predicted that this is how I would have reacted in this situation. And it wasn't just a little bit of fear, it was an enormous amount of fear.
Yeah.
So the impetus for the paper was about, what do you do when you have an experience like that? What do you do when you experience an emotion that is surprising, that is, in some sense, unwelcome to you? that is something that you didn't expect at all, and that in some sense feels very contrasting to how you've seen yourself, to your own self-conception. What do you do about those emotions? And the line that I end up taking in the paper is that I think it's a mistake to dismiss them. I think that's a
Right.
very easy and understandable thing. I think anybody I've talked to about the mouse incident has always said, well, it was the middle of the night and you're heightened anyway, and the mouse scared you, and that's a very easy thing. But to me, that doesn't quite represent sort of the honesty or the reality of the situation, which is that, look, I really had this, I'm troubled by it. I'm troubled still by the reaction that I had.
Yeah.
And it sort of has changed in some sense how I see myself. And so that, I feel like, I actually think that's okay. It's okay for us to treat these emotions. So alienated emotions are the emotions that are surprising, contrasting to your self-image, in some sense unwelcome, emotions that you experience that you don't expect yourself to have. I just think it's a mistake to dismiss them, in part because I am committed to the view that your emotions tell you stuff. They
Right.
tell you stuff about the world. They also tell you stuff about you, and to tell you stuff about your relations to other people. Sometimes they tell you things that you don't already know. And so
Or want
that
to know.
is what,
Or want to know.
or want to know. And so if I'm committed to that view, then I have to sort of take seriously emotions like alienated emotions, because I absolutely am committed to the view that your alienated emotion might be right, and your self-conception and the judgments that you've made about who you think you are, they might be wrong.
And an alienated emotion through something like, good psychotherapy, because there's lots of bad psychotherapy out there, or, think about virtue ethics, not as just a moralizing work, but as like, deciding to deliberately work on your character, or I don't know, spiritual direction, or any of these other things where
Yeah.
you're making advances. Can an alienated emotion cease to be alienated and become integrated within your self-understanding and your sort of long-term narrative of who you
Mm-hmm.
are?
Yeah, I do think that's possible, right? And I think so for me, and I don't have anything written on this, and my views about it are still in sort of the infancy stage. But I'm really interested in this question of like what Charles Taylor calls self-interpretation, and how do you do that well? And how do
Mm.
you do that
Oh,
sort of
yeah.
without self-deception, with honesty, but also, in all sorts of, like, how does that go? How does that go well? And I think when you're dealing with alienated emotions, it might look, you don't know ahead of time when you experience it. You don't know ahead of time what's going to happen with the emotion. It
Yeah.
could remain alienated. You could end up sort of altering your self-conception in a way. Like, I could come to decide, you know what, actually, I am afraid of mice. And that maybe didn't used to be true about me, but it's clearly true about me now. And
Yeah.
so I change based on this experience. I sort of change the way that I understand myself. And now I say, well, I know maybe I am a person who's afraid of mice. Or maybe I sort of exist in this state of ambivalence where I'm not totally sure and I don't really know what to do. And I don't necessarily rush to kind of settle the question.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be tempting to write off these sort of experiences in two different ways, depending on whether you believe in acrosia or not. I'm a firm believer that acrosia, which is lack or loss of self-control,
Right,
it's a real thing. I mean, I've experienced it myself. People who claim that it doesn't exist, they're almost like on a different planet,
right.
as far as I'm concerned. So, I mean, it would be tempting to say, oh, well, it's just one incident. Normally I'm this way, but everybody has failures. Or you could go like this, the Socratic Stoic route. It's actually amathia. It's a lack of proper knowledge or something like that. And it seems to me that I think you're completely right about this, that these are things that we do have to think about and make an effort to try to understand and integrate, rather than just simply taking these easy strategies of which are offered to us of writing them off.
Yeah.
And I'm curious. So, I mean, we could think of all sorts of things like feeling a sort of poignancy of grief over watching a movie, a clear fictional situation, but it somehow connects to us and we're like, oh, I feel so sad right now.
Mhm.
And it doesn't make sense. Why am I crying? Or
Mhm.
losing our temper after we've been a really mild person and then we
Right.
blow up, or, but could you have the thing that you're calling alienated emotions? Could there also be cases where you're not feeling something that you were feeling before, or you think that you ought to feel? So I don't know, you're involved with somebody in a romantic relationship, and then suddenly the feeling is gone, and you're like, oh,
Mhm.
what's going on here?
Mhm.
I better figure out how to rekindle this because I've made a commitment to this
Mhm.
relationship, but it's
Mhm.
suddenly not there. Or
Yep.
I don't not feeling anger when you normally would.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so is the alienated just has to be that it doesn't make sense to me, or it's
Um,
uncharacteristic, or
right. That's a good question. So I don't know exactly how sort of technical I want to be with the alienated emotions. What I want to maintain, I think, is the element of sort of unexpectedness or surprise.
Mm,
So you
okay.
find yourself in a situation where you expect yourself to feel a certain way and you don't, or you don't expect yourself to feel a certain way and then suddenly you do. And I think that actually, and the reason I'm interested in this obviously is because I think it happens more than people realize that it happens. And so you end up with, you're in
Yeah.
all sorts of situations where you think, on my wedding day, I come from a very long line of criers, right? Very emotional
Okay.
family,
Yeah.
lots and lots of criers. So I just assumed on my wedding day, I'm going to be in tears the entire day. Incorrect. I was cool as a cucumber. I was the only person in the entire situation other than some of the guests who was cool as a cucumber. And that was completely surprising to me. A welcome surprise, I grant you, but
Yeah. Yeah.
completely surprising to me. And I still don't have an explanation for why I was that way. So that kind of experience, I think, is actually like pretty familiar to people.
Yeah.
And we also, to your point about sort of being in situations where you think you should feel certain things, we are pretty bad about this. I think
Yeah.
we tend to tell ourselves a lot of stories about because we tend to be very judgmental about our emotions. And so we tend to tell ourselves a lot of stories about how we should feel in certain circumstances. Sometimes that's a reasonable criticism. It's not always, though,
Yeah.
because there have been, how many of us have been in romantic relationships where something is wrong and something is missing, but you are telling yourself that everything should be fine and you should be happy, and why aren't you happy? And so we will then try to kind of force ourselves to start, you'll start talking yourself into it and trying to talk yourself into this emotion, when in reality, maybe there is actually something wrong with your situation and you're picking up on that through your sort of emotional life, but you're not necessarily picking up on that through your judgmental or your, I'm not going to say rational because I don't like the divide between rational and
Right. Right.
emotional, but you're sort of like conscious judgmental life.
So that goes right back to your new book. Um, what are so bad emotions, right?
Bad
What
emotions,
makes
yeah.
bad emotions or bad feelings
Hmm.
actually bad? What
Hmm.
are some of the examples of emotions that people feel they ought not to feel, that you want to say, no, there's some scope for this?
Yeah, so there's a pretty broad range of what might count as a bad feeling. In the book, I kind of narrow it down to the ones that I think people think of as pretty morally questionable.
Okay.
So they're the ones that I can't remember who is it that makes this distinction, but there's a philosopher who makes, I believe it's Robert C. Roberts, who makes this distinction between sort of the he calls them the nasty emotions, or it might be Robert Solomon who calls them the nasty emotions. And the nasty emotions are the ones that people really they'll judge themselves very harshly for feeling it, or they'll feel like there's some you have a character flaw maybe if
Right.
you have these kinds of emotions. So the ones that I talk about in the book specifically are anger, contempt, jealousy and envy, spite, and schadenfreude.
Okay. Yeah, that's that. I mean, a lot of that fits right into Aristotle
Mm-hmm.
quite nicely,
Mm-hmm.
So, so broadening it a little bit. I mean, let's take something like grief. From the perspective of, say, the Stoics, it's always a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
I would say there's probably, quite a few schools of psychology and psychotherapy that won't say, well, it's a bad thing, it's a necessary thing, but you should process it and get through it and leave it behind you. Would that fit into this schema? Because, you know, if you're grieving somebody, like, you know, I've actually, you know, experienced a lot of death and loss in my
Yeah.
family life and stuff like that. And I'll go to people who had a big loss, and I'll say, you know, 6 months down the line, a year down the line, when everybody wants you to have gotten over this, if you want to reach out to me, go ahead, because I'll actually listen to you talk about how
Yeah.
you miss your mom or something like that.
Mhm.
Because most people want you to, like, you know, there's like an orderly thing, maybe a
Absolutely.
month, and then you should be finished. So would that
Mhm.
fit in with this, um, you know, bad
Mhm.
feelings?
So this is where my like, as you mentioned the wild romantics earlier, this is
Yeah.
where my wild romantic streak comes out, because
Okay.
so I adore Aristotle. I don't think this kind of division of, well, right time, right place, right proportion, etc. I get how tempting that is. I really understand how tempting it is to sort of be able to incorporate your emotions that way and to manage them that way.
Yeah.
But I don't think it is actually capturing how they really work. And I
Okay.
also don't think it's capturing the role that they ought to play in their
Mm,
lives. So I'm not,
okay.
so can they be tamed in this way? Can they be managed the way that Aristotle and Confucius in particular, they were my two guys
Yeah.
who kind of represent this view. Can they? I don't know. That jury's still out on how much how much control we have. I want to resist the idea that the kind of relationship we should have toward them is to manage them in that way. Actually, maybe we should have a different relationship toward them for precisely the reasons that you say
I
about
mean,
grief.
could you say that, like, maybe some of the time, like in everyday stuff, we should be managing them and learning how to integrate our affective and cognitive side, and, you know, be a decent person in life and
Yeah.
have the right kind of responses, right? But that there should be much more room
Mm,
for, let's call it, unusual or extraordinary
mhm,
cases.
mhm,
And rather than just saying, okay, we cut, you know, we've got the limit here,
mhm,
I don't know, a well integrated person won't feel this sort of stuff. I
mhm.
mean, I think what you're saying is, no, a well integrated person will feel this sort of stuff because they're a human
Absolutely.
being,
Absolutely.
and they're subject to, you know, a contingent world in which
Mhm.
weird things happen.
Absolutely.
And then figuring out how to, you know,
Mhm.
reincorporate these is important.
Yeah, so this is, so I think, and I'm not sure, I think maybe sort of my vision of what, you know, a good emotional life and what like maybe Aristotle or Confucius's vision of a good emotional life, I think on the surface they might look the same. Um, I think that general picture, the sort of what I call the kind of Confucius, or I call it the cultivated emotion saints in
Okay.
the book. It's about cultivating your emotions, right? And it's
Yeah.
not about trying to get rid of them. It's not about trying to diminish the power that they have. It's about sort of like integrating them right into your life and making them training them to sort of be a part of your life.
Yeah.
Um, what I think would be better, and in some sense more true to the way emotions are and the role that they should play, is actually to learn how to be comfortable with a part of you
Mm,
that you don't really control.
okay.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
rather than trying to sort of tame them,
But
integrate them, make them kind of play a part,
yeah.
what would it look like instead to have a certain kind of perspective on your emotional life and realize that because you're a human being subject to all kinds of contingent things, that your emotional life is going to be a complicated place. And it's not necessarily going to be something that you actually can manage all the time, or
Yeah.
even, you know, what would that look like? What would it look like to actually be more comfortable with having that kind of wild romantic part of you?
Yeah. And, you know, there couldn't be any straight across the board set of rules or procedures for
Right,
that, right?
right,
Because it is contingent. So you
exactly,
can't know whether this well integrated, grounded person who seems to get through everything, when they, I don't know, we'll take grief again. Somebody dies and they're not really that close to it. Suddenly this person is crying at their desk.
exactly.
Um, yeah, you can't effectively predict that sort of
Hmm.
thing. So
Hmm.
does that mean we're always playing catch up then when it comes to this?
Possibly. I mean, can you say more about what you mean by catch up?
Well, so you know, you can't adequately prepare, except in a very general sense of being able to say, well, let's not dismiss these things for the
Right.
weird outlier kind of emotional events that we have or we see other people having.
Right. Yes. And so I am a big advocate. I think where I land on this is, so what can you do if we're gonna say we're gonna figure out how to live well with a thing that we don't really control or can't control fully. So what does
Yeah.
that look like? So I think there are two things that are going to be key for this. One, we have got to work on emotional honesty,
Okay.
where that means you have to get to know your feelings. And I use I talk about this in the conclusion, and I use Thoreau when Thoreau is kind of talking about he has this great line in Higher Laws where he's talking about sort of these times in the woods where he says, I'm was raving like a half-starved hound, but he talks about sort of getting to know the wilderness, really getting to know it, really exploring it, and not trying to sort of take his preconceived notions about what it is, but actually living through it is what allows him to kind of see it for what it really is and to not really be afraid of it anymore. And so I think that's going to be really key for living with our emotions in this way, is to really explore them, to feel them, to be honest when they're there, and not necessarily, and that's going to require a lot. I mean, I actually don't think we're particularly good at this. I think this is going to require a lot of work. So honesty, emotional honesty, and really getting to know and understand your emotions and being able to tell the difference, let's say, between your frustration and your anger, and knowing what those feel like. That's going to be one piece. I think the other piece, and this is where when we criticize people for being too emotional, I think oftentimes we're not necessarily criticizing them for the feelings. I think what we're actually criticizing them for is the things they care about that lie behind the feelings. So I think mostly when we're talking about people getting too angry or something like that, it's not so much the anger that we're mad about, it's that they don't have a sense of proportion.
Right.
Or a sense of like what's significant and what's not, or a sense
Yeah.
of perspective, like understand that there are some things that are big and some things that are small, but that itself, that's not really an emotional thing exactly. That's just, and I don't know how to teach someone to have perspective, but I think that's usually when we're criticizing, that's what we're criticizing. And so if that's right, then there's like some set of other kinds of virtues, I'm going to call them, that we can develop that are not necessarily taming our emotional lives, but that are kind of setting ourselves up in to avoid the kinds of criticisms that we usually lodge at the emotional person.
Yeah, I mean, from a traditional virtue ethics perspective, whether it's like, Platonic or Aristotelian or Stoic or pick whatever you want, I think a lot of people's response would be, well, that's where phronesis comes in, practical wisdom, tells you what to do and all that. But that seems kind of wrong. I mean, I'm more attracted to the idea that I think I just heard you articulate that we need plural, and we won't even say whether they're intellectual or moral virtues. They're just habituses. There's something that we build up in ourselves that give us a capacity for discernment and making good judgments. And it's difficult to classify those. I mean, the temptation is to say, well, they all just fall under one big thing that we call practical wisdom, but that can't be right.
Yeah, I'm a much more, anytime anybody starts talking about sort of unity and integration and, all that, I'm like,
virtues?
Stop. Well, not so much of the virtues. It's just, I feel like people are very, philosophers in particular are very into this idea of you have to be whole and you have to be not conflicted and you have to be integrated and all the parts have to sing beautifully together. And I think I'm just not attracted to that. I'm much more attracted to a kind of fragmented, we got to be okay with being broken, and that's okay. We can still be all right and be broken. It doesn't have to be, the push isn't always to sort of make sure that there's perfect inner harmony all of the time.
I'll go off on a little rant at this point. So when somebody like invokes things like the thesis of the unity of the virtues, my eyes kind of glaze over and I quit paying attention to it. Just like when they're like, Aristotle's function argument. I'm like, well, that's not in the text,
Right.
And the text is a lot more complicated and fragmentary, and the idea of somebody who actually, whatever list of virtues we've got, the idea of somebody who actually possesses all of them, to me, I'm like, I've never seen a human being remotely like that. I'm
No.
much more attracted to thinkers like, Nietzsche, who thinks that
Yeah,
the virtues war against each other.
absolutely.
Or, John Cassian actually has a really funny thing to say about this. I think it's in early on in the Institutes. He says, listen, the best you can have is like one virtue, most. You know? And
That's great.
he's got a theological perspective. He's like, how can you have a unity of the virtues? Only in this super special guy, Christ, being part of a whole community, right?
Right.
And I don't want to be as pessimistic as him and say you can only cultivate one single virtue.
Yeah.
But I mean, the idea that you're going to, first of all, well, if you got one, you got them all, that seems like so empirically, obviously wrong,
Right.
And
Yeah.
then you're like, well, who the hell are they? Who are these people theorizing
Who
about?
are we talking about?
Exactly.
Yeah, that has always been and this is, as you can imagine, this is one of my sort of bones to pick with Nussbaum, is that there's a kind of, right, there's the holding, which exemplars are we talking about? And when you're telling me that the people you're talking about are Christ and like Martin Luther King Jr., which is, I'm not even sure that that's an accurate picture of Martin Luther King Jr., but okay. Maybe that, and Gandhi. Okay, listen, I think we need to like have a conversation about what we're looking for in our if they are your emotional exemplars. I think maybe we need to have a little conversation about what our expectations are.
So this is a great segue into this review that you have, which is much more than a book review. It's a critical book review of Nussbaum's recent.
That makes it sound so fancy.
Well, I mean, that's the genre, quite frankly.
That's
right?
true. That's
So,
true.
I mean, you do the traditional book review thing, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and you don't like pull out any criticisms at those points. And then more than half of the piece is saying, I think she got this wrong. I mean, she's right about this, but she also tweaked this in the wrong direction. And here's some assumptions that she made.
Yeah.
Now, I use this book as a textbook for a class that I teach, a semester-long class on anger at Marquette University. That's part of their core thing. So I'm not teaching it to philosophy people. I'm teaching it to like juniors and seniors who generally they've had like a philosophy class and they're not particularly interested in it, right? But everybody's interested in anger. And I picked the book, having read it before and having some problems of my own with Nussbaum. I was like, well, this can at least provide some structure, right? But I think I may actually, the next time that I get to teach this class, I may actually include this particular book review within the materials for the class, because there's so many places where you're like, okay, she's right about this. Here's where the assumption goes wrong. And so, I mean, I don't want to like just pick on Nussbaum. Maybe we can widen this. What do you think are some of the, and it doesn't have to just be anger. Some of the things you're pointing out really figure into broader misconceptions of emotions that people are using. What would you say are some of the most important ones?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple. There are two that I really tackle sort of head on in the book. So one is again, the position that I think is sort of associated with Nussbaum. And again, I should say, just as an aside, I should say, the reason that those of us who do contemporary work in emotions are here is in part because of her, and her early work is like fantastic. And, so I can only be so critical, but I can definitely be critical. That there's this assumption that sort of negative emotions are something like fundamentally irrational. They are, they're always mistaken. There's something, anytime you're feeling them, you're making some kind of rational mistake, or who knows, right? There are these kind of irrational forces. And you see this view, not just in Nussbaum, but in other people, right? There's this kind of view about negative emotions as, this angry, irrational forces that are part of our human nature because we're flawed or something like that. And they're there to torture us. And we are, we would do our best if we figured out how to be better humans, how to get rid of that part of ourselves. And this is this is one of the things I talk about in the book is this aspiration to what I call emotional sainthood. So I think this is a very powerful ideal that people hold, whether they realize it or not. And it's this kind of view that all things considered, it would be better if human beings did not have negative emotions. And there are lots of people who will say yes, and that would be good, and we should strive for it. And I think those are the folks who hold up like Christ, for example, or these kind of exemplars of we have to transcend, we have to transform our human nature in order to do this, and that would be better. But people don't do it because it's super hard, and people are flawed and lazy, and so they just don't do it. And then I think there's another way of responding to emotional sainthood, which is to say, well, look, no, that's not attainable for us. Look, that's not possible. It's not possible for us to get rid of all these negative emotions. The best we can manage is to just, lessen their influence on us, or manage them in the right kinds of ways. This is the kind of like Aristotle Confucian sort of view, or train ourselves to like get our gratitude journal and start doing the gratitude journal, right? And sort of like that's going to train, but it would still be so just, we can't get rid of them, but manage them right, or feel them as little, like even less would be better. So a little bit of sainthood goes a long way. And what I want to do is get rid of the aspiration.
Okay.
Like, it's not like let's don't aspire to emotional sainthood. Don't look at emotional sainthood and say that's the best version of a human life. Think to yourself instead, no. You can have a good human life, and that negative emotions, not in spite of your negative emotions, but the negative emotions are an integral part of your good human life. They're not obstacles to living well. They're part of what it means to live well.
But not all negative emotions, right? Whether we're talking in the broad, like classes of them, or in particular instances, we still do want to have, if I see somebody who, I don't know, I've had friends who've had like terrible relationships over and over and over again, and they choose the wrong person, and they stay in them too long, and some of them are my family members. I'm just not going to say it.
right no names.
But I think we all know people like that, right? And you could be like, you ask them, what are you doing there? And they're like, oh, I just, I'm afraid of being alone, which that would be a negative emotion. Or I love the thrill that I get when I'm with the screwed up person. Some of these you could say, okay, I would say some of this could be okay. Like you're trying this stuff out, but let's not do this the rest of your life, So how do we differentiate between the negative or bad emotions that we've made some room for, legitimate room, and then ones where we're like, no, this really is damaging to the person and their relationships. We ought to say, don't be like that, without telling them to be a saint.
Right. I'm so glad you asked that. So this is the part where I think my view starts to get a little challenging. Okay. So I am actually comfortable making room for even those emotions.
Okay.
And the reason I am comfortable with that is because I think we mistakenly pin the trouble on the emotions themselves. And I think actually more often than not, what's happening is that there's a different thing people are doing. And that what ends up happening is the trouble starts when we start this is in an incredibly technical term that I use, when we start doing something with our feelings.
Okay.
And doing something looks a lot of different ways, right? So, and it's in contrast to just feel the damn thing. So we do all sorts of things with our emotions. My favorite example of this is envy, right? Envy comes with an enormous suite of coping mechanisms. And I think most of the time what's happening is the trouble starts with the coping mechanisms, not the feeling. And the reason we start doing bad coping mechanisms is because we are allergic to just sitting there and going, I feel envy right now.
Yeah.
That hurts. We don't like that. It makes us squirm. And because we are like so resistant to just experiencing the negativity, we start trying to take that negativity and do something with it. So that's where you get the crappy coping mechanisms like, I envy my neighbor's new car, gonna go grab the baseball bat from my garage and solve this problem right now by bashing in the headlights. But it's also where you get the like, hustle culture, grind set
Mm,
attitude, where people start going, well, do you envy that person for their new car? Well, then I'm going to use that as motivation to save more money so that I can
yeah,
too
yeah,
can get right. And what we are absolutely allergic to is just going, gosh, I'm so envious of that car. Full stop.
yeah.
And just experiencing the negativity. I think most of the time when emotions, when we're saying that negative emotion is causing trouble, what we're actually seeing is that person does not know how to just feel that thing. And so they are doing all kinds of stuff in response to that feeling that is causing all manner of issues.
So some of that could be from just ignorance or inexperience, right?
Sure.
Or bad models of seeing how
Sure.
other people handle
Mm-hmm.
that. But I mean, we could talk about, and I never want to use the word meta because it winds up spiraling off into meta. But
Right, right,
I mean,
right.
we could talk about a fear of one's own emotions,
Exactly.
right? So a fear
Mm-hmm.
to linger in
Yep.
anger that you can't do anything with, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that is 100% part of this. There's a big
Mm,
layer of judgment, of fear, because if you think about it, look, we haven't hatched from eggs here. We have existed in a culture,
right.
particularly those of us who grew up in the US, that is just so resistant to negativity, right? Positivity and the power of positive thinking and positive emotions and all that stuff is in the water, particularly in the US, and we are very uncomfortable with
Yeah.
negativity. And so we have built up layers and layers and layers of judgment about those feelings. So you start to feel envy, and immediately you start jumping to, I'm a bad person. People are going to judge me. If I keep feeling this, it's going to eat me up from the inside.
Right.
Notice this is what I call the emotion double standard. Actually, we say
Mm,
all kinds of things about negative emotions that we never say about positive emotions. No one
okay.
ever says to you, oh God, your joy is going to eat you up from the inside. No one ever says to you, you need to process your joy and then move on.
People do with I can think
Really?
of
Do
a
they?
kind of counterexample. But it's narrow in its scope. So when somebody takes joy and maybe some other emotions as well, so desire, things like that, and it's in something that's felt to be too unserious or trivial or something
Mm,
like that. So
mm.
fandoms, right?
Oh, interesting.
Now I'm not a fan, so I'm not into like superhero movies, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The whole Marvel universe, but there are people who really geek out about that, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And they get quite invested in it, and a new
Yeah.
movie comes out and they're like, oh my god, I'm going to go to the theater and see this is going to be a
Totally. Yeah,
amazing
yeah, yeah, yeah.
experience and
Yeah.
stuff like that. And
Yeah.
then we look at them and we're like, oh, look at what a geek that person is,
Right.
so silly, there's
Yeah.
real problems in the
Yeah.
world, or you should be appreciating fine movies or something,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And, with music, right? So I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure as a fellow metalhead, you probably
Yes.
ran into dismissive people who are like,
Absolutely.
that's not
Absolutely.
real music.
That's not real music.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
As a matter of fact, I'll tell you a funny story, just real quick. So when
Yeah.
I was 16 years old, I got in a lot of trouble. I actually became a ward of the court and I was
Oh
placed in the
no.
juvenile detention center. And they let us do like field trips. And there was a girl on this field trip, and she was like into classical music, very sort of, I don't know what she was in for. She must have done something wrong, but she kind of had her nose in the air. And I was typical. I had long hair and looked kind of sketchy. And we're sitting there in the car, and I knew something about music, so I was like, heavy metal has a lot in common with classical.
Mm-hmm.
And she turned to me with this like absolute image of contempt, and she said, who rattled your cage? Like
Oh.
you're an ape,
Oh,
and then she
geez.
didn't talk to me after that, and I was like very taken aback by it.
Wow. Wow.
But that's sort of like, oh, the things that
Mm-hmm.
you silly people enjoy. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe there is something like that. Or
Yeah.
I suppose like positive emotions, love would be another one where like
Mm-hmm.
you're bestowing love on somebody unworthy of your love when you should
Mm-hmm.
be giving it to somebody better. Like,
Right.
take the cat thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
your pet mouse, I don't know. So
Yeah.
people will be like, you shouldn't be that attached to a
It's
dumb
just a
animal.
pet. Yeah.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't you being this loving to, I don't know,
Yeah.
your students or something?
Right. Right. And so I guess I would want to know, is the criticism that we're making there, is the criticism of the emotion, or is the criticism like what the value is that's lying behind it? Right. So are we criticizing people because they
Yeah. Or the
care about the
target.
wrong things?
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, you shouldn't care about that. But what we are doing is, in making that criticism, we're recognizing that the emotion that you have toward that thing is an expression of your care.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, oh, the reason that you take so much joy in that Marvel movie is because you really like it, but you're investing too much time in it.
I think there has to either be a comparison. You're enjoying, you're loving this thing too much when you should be doing this thing over here. Or it could be just something where the person themselves is being dismissed for being part of a class of unserious people.
Yeah, that's and I think with heavy metal in particular, that there's very much a sort of a class. There's some class stuff that's kind of like tied up in this, right? Because it's, classical music is coded upper class,
right.
Heavy metal is coded lower class.
Yeah. Well, that's quite interesting. So envy is a good one for that. I mean, could there be, you mentioned contempt, and I imagine what you mean by that is something like the classic cataphronesis, looking down upon.
Yeah.
How would that be a useful or appropriate emotional response?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think I think one of the things that we do with negative emotions is we tend to focus on what I call the extreme cases. Okay. So again, back to envy, we look at Iago from Shakespeare and we go, wow, that's envy, right? Like that. And so what we don't do is look at the very boring, mundane, typical kind of cases of envy in our like very normal human social life. If we kind of take, and I think contempt like so very much suffers from this, because we look at contempt and we think, oh, that's, you're dehumanizing someone,
right,
when you're talking about contempt, right? And so that I want to go like, okay, time out. Think about exercise culture. I'm a runner. I do yoga. Here's a thing you sometimes hear when you're like, when I first started out running, I would go on like online running forums to kind of get support and tips and that sort of stuff. And one of the things you would very frequently see is, well, even if you're a brand new runner and you don't know what you're doing, you're still lapping everyone who's on the couch. Which is okay, it's funny and humorous and silly.
Motivation,
But what is it? What's the communication there? Right? There, you're better than somebody else. Same thing happened in yoga. Like that contempt, mild. It's mild. I think we don't even look at that as contempt because it's so mild.
Right.
But at the end of the day, contempt is really about looking down on someone. It's going like, well, I'm not like that. That's contempt in its kind of mundane version. Is that like really morally attractive? Well, I'm not defending negative emotions because they're all morally attractive. Like, that's not my point. My point is sort of defend them at their place in our lives in general, even when we're not thinking about sort of virtue. So is contempt virtuous? No, contempt's not virtuous, but it is a part of self-building. So when you are, and we all go through this, when you are in stages in your life where you feel shaky and you don't really know, am I making, like when you become a runner, am I making progress? Am I kind of floundering here? What am I doing? I sort of need to look around and kind of compare myself to people and say, well, I'm definitely not as good as those people, but I'm maybe not so bad as those people. So like, maybe I'm doing okay. That I think is pretty harmless. And I think it's this thing we do all the time. Where we get into trouble is kind of using those moments to sort of assure ourselves that we're never going to be on the wrong end of the comparison, right? So, I mean, look, there's plenty, trust me, as a runner who is not fast, there are plenty of people who have used me and gone, I'm not like her, and I got to be aware of that. At the same time, I'm doing it to the people who are behind me. And like eventually you don't want to sort of stay there and do it forever and get obsessed with those kinds of comparisons. But those kinds of, like, where does self-confidence come from? It doesn't drop from the sky. You have to build it. And so how are you going to build it if you never kind of look around and try to gauge where you are? Again, is that like virtuous? No. But is it vicious? I actually don't think it's that vicious.
Well, this is something quite important for people who are interested in virtue ethics. There's often this tendency to say, if you're going to be a virtue ethicist or take a virtue ethics perspective for orienting your life, then virtue has to really be the only thing that counts. And sometimes
Exactly.
they'll say, well, Aristotle also said some money and some friends, and that's nice. But all of this other stuff that's neither virtuous nor vicious, and may actually be like what the Stoics call the indifference. It's at a lower level of value. It really does matter.
Yeah.
And it's part of a well integrated, or at
Hmm.
least semi well integrated
Yeah.
life, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I didn't start out as like a Bernard Williams fan, but I became one sort of as doing this work
Okay.
because I think he really has that criticism sort of right. I'm a moral philosopher. It's what I do. It's the reason I get out of bed in the morning. But I think moral philosophy, especially when it comes to emotions, has this kind of imperializing tendency
Right.
to sort of look at absolutely every aspect of your life and try to fit it into this kind of moral framework. And
Yeah.
I just think Williams is flat right about this, that this is not really a way to think about human life, and that we kind of need to have a bit more of a holistic picture of human life and not necessarily try. We can talk about values and things that are important and things that we should care about that aren't necessarily undergirded by a kind of moral value or
Okay.
moral concern. And it
Yeah.
took me a long time to get to that place. And I'm
Oh, that's
feeling more
interesting.
comfortable with
Why
it.
was
Yeah.
that the case? Why did
I'm a Kantian like through and through, and
okay.
I very much and like if you like total aside, we can talk about Kant I think he's actually a little bit more friendly to Williams than people realize, but I get that that's a controversial interpretation, so I'm going to set that aside.
Okay.
I think when you start writing, when I started my career, it was like you look at the literature, and I want to defend negative emotions. I want to talk about those. I think those are interesting. You look at the lit, and everything in the lit is doing this move where it's actually the emotion is an immoral emotion. Did you know that? It's moral, right? It's just a different conception. Like, let's widen the lens, and this is what and so the way of defending negative emotions is to say, well, it's a negative emotion, but it's still moral.
Right. Right.
And as I was writing, I was like, I don't think that's the move I want to make. Like, I
Well,
actually don't want to turn all of these things into moral emotions.
yeah, and it kind of narrows it, right? It
Yes.
becomes,
Yeah.
well, so let's take, Strawson and resentment and stuff like that. Well, it's okay because it's serving a moral
Mm-hmm.
purpose, but as
Right.
soon as it stops doing that,
Right.
now it's back to being a bad
That's
emotion
right.
again.
And that's the other. So earlier I talked about sort of the Nussbaum kind of view that was, you have to
Right.
transcend, and like this is how you deal with negative emotions. And then I think there's a really strong, particularly in contemporary philosophy, there's a really strong tendency to say, no, 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 don't transcend, but realize the moral importance of. So we're happy to defend a version of righteous anger. We're happy to
Right. Right.
defend a version of righteous contempt. We're happy to try to defend a righteous jealousy or righteous envy or whatever. And I'm like, no, not that either. Like that's not. So I don't love transcend, but I also don't like the idea that we can only care about these emotions and value them when they're righteous.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm going to shift the conversation a bit, to an area that I know you know quite a bit about. So ethics of care, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we're teaching it, it's kind of tricky because it's a little bit amorphous and it's been developing. But one of the things that I will tell students is that, emotions wind up being brought back into the picture, and that, what we really want to stress is concern or care or empathy, right?
Right.
And people generally view these positively. Um, but it seems like, we have to be quite careful with this. I mean, and there's plenty of literature out there. You don't want to care so much or show concern so much that you ignore your own needs and
Right.
stuff like that, right? But that, on the one hand, you get the hyper masculine people, or I suppose just people who've like managed to turn off their emotional life,
Mm-hmm.
and they're like, this is irrational. You must not be indulging yourself in this
Right.
sort of
Right.
thing,
Right.
right? Or, that's womanly. We don't want that sort of thing. I mean, forget the fact that like ancient virtue ethics talked constantly about emotions, right?
Right.
Um, and then, on the other hand, we have the people who like, well, so long as you're being empathetic, even if it's with
Right.
somebody who's a terrible person and wants to, beat the
Mhm.
crap out of their spouse, and you're like taking in their side and showing them sympathy and care and
Mhm.
all that, that's good, right?
Yep.
And you want to say, no, that's if anybody, you should be caring about the victim, not the
Mhm.
aggressor.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. There's a different sort of that can get played out in like a couple different ways. There's this one view that seems to, and I don't know where exactly this comes from, but it's a weird. I don't, you don't see it too much in philosophy, I don't think, but it's a kind of offshoot of romanticism, right? Which is
okay.
to sort of say, emotions are there's a kind of purity that's attributed to them.
Okay.
So they are always good and they
Oh,
know
right.
and
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
right and they're a kind of like oracle inside of you that you should always listen to, right? And that sort of and that's not, again, that's like way overly rosy picture of our emotional life, and that somehow it's almost like it's a weird sort of like tractor beam that's going to automatically, if you just listen to your sympathy, it's going to take you directly into the right direction. And
Right. Yeah.
it's I don't know if is there anybody in the history of philosophy that holds that view? Like even people who are very pro sympathy, I feel like I'm not totally sure that that's right. I mean, maybe there's like some version of Rousseau I think you could attribute
I
that view
guess.
to, like
Yeah.
a little bit, but even then I feel like it's more complicated than that. But so you see that, but then you also see, I think, a kind of like yeah, so there's this lionizing of your emotional life in a way that it's sort of in the in the traditional kind of, sometimes you get feminist philosophers kind of telling this story of like reason was king and
Right.
denigrated emotions and blah blah blah. Let's don't do the thing where, let's don't just do the opposite, right? Like let's don't like hold emotions up as now they're king and reason's not king, and it's like, but there's no king. How about we don't have a king? Like
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
the way we could handle this.
Yeah, and if we want to follow out that model, well, then no king, who's going to rule? Well, we need something like not necessarily democracy where every single person
Mm-hmm.
gets to say their thing. And so every weird, quirky emotion gets to like come to the fore. But, maybe something like an aristocratic morality or is the model, right? There's the betters,
Yeah.
and they may not necessarily be the morally better, but they all get to
Mm-hmm.
like say something, and they have like,
Yeah.
emotions working for them. I mean, here we're getting into like very speculative
Yeah,
stuff,
yeah,
but
yeah. Right. Yeah.
well, I want to be respectful of your time, and thanks for
Oh
giving so
yeah,
much of
absolutely.
it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there anything else that you want to bring up before we finish up?
Um, no, I don't think so. I mean, I hope I just want to stress again for the folks who are watching out there that, the new book is really it's for everybody. I don't want people to be
That's
intimidated
great.
just
Yeah.
because it's a philosophy book. It's not, no expertise required. I really wanted it to be welcoming and inviting to people, anybody who wants to think about their negative emotions. Again, hope the philosophers out there will like it, but I really wanted it to be sort of for everyone.
Well, that's excellent. So
Yeah.
great conversation. Thanks so
Yeah.
much for
Thanks for having
coming
me.
on.
Yeah, thanks.